The wedding day was finally here. It was a grand celebration, the kind that people talked about for weeks. The sun shone brightly over the luxurious country club, where everything was decorated to perfection. White roses lined the aisles, golden chandeliers sparkled, and a soft melody played in the background. Guests arrived in expensive suits and elegant dresses, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the beautiful evening. Andrew, the groom, came from a wealthy family. His parents were proud of their high status and had invited only the most influential people in the city. Business leaders, politicians, and socialites filled the room, all eager to celebrate the big day. The bride, Emily, was kind and well-liked, and her father, Richard Lawson, was one of the city's most respected businessmen. Among the guests was a man who didn't seem familiar to most people there. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His name was Daniel Carter. He wasn't a close friend of the couple, but had been invited by one of Emily's distant relatives. Unlike most of the guests, Daniel preferred to stay in the background, watching everything with a calm smile. He didn't rush to introduce himself or seek attention. He simply observed and enjoyed the celebration. As the night continued, the waiters moved through the crowd, serving expensive champagne and gourmet dishes. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Everything seemed perfect, but not everyone was happy. Andrew, the groom, had noticed Daniel earlier and kept glancing in his direction. There was something about him that made Andrew uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. Andrew leaned over to one of his friends and whispered, "Who invited him?" His voice was low, but his tone was sharp. His friend shrugged. "No idea, but he seems harmless." Andrew wasn't convinced. He watched as Daniel spoke politely with a few guests, nodding and smiling. But in Andrew's mind, something felt off. He wasn't used to seeing unfamiliar faces at events like this, especially people he didn't personally know. Then something happened that made Andrew's suspicion grow even stronger. His best man rushed up to him, looking worried. "Hey man," he said, pulling Andrew aside. "I just checked the groom's suite. Your watch is missing." Andrew's eyes widened. It wasn't just any watch. It was an expensive one, a gift from his father, worth more than most people's cars. His first reaction was shock, then anger. He quickly looked around the room. His mind raced. Someone must have taken it. And then his gaze landed on Daniel. A thought formed in his mind, one that he didn't say out loud but felt strongly. Daniel was the only guest he didn't know. And for some reason, that was enough for Andrew to make a dangerous assumption. The party went on, but in Andrew's mind, a storm was brewing. He wasn't going to let this go. Andrew couldn't focus on anything else. The missing watch was all he could think about. His wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, yet here he was, feeling restless and uneasy. He kept scanning the room, his eyes always finding their way back to Daniel. The man seemed calm, chatting politely with a few guests, unaware that someone was watching him closely. Andrew's best man leaned in again. "What do you want to do? Should we call security?" he asked quietly. Andrew hesitated. He didn't want to cause a scene, not in front of all these important people, but at the same time, he wasn't the type to let things slide. His watch was expensive, and there was no way it had just disappeared on its own. Someone had taken it, and in his mind, the answer seemed clear. He took a deep breath, trying to act normal. He walked over to his father, who was deep in conversation with a group of businessmen. "Dad," he whispered, "I need to talk to you." His father frowned but excused himself from the conversation. "What is it?" he asked. "My watch is missing," Andrew said in a low voice. "The one you gave me." His father's face darkened. "What? When did you last see it?" "This afternoon, in my suite. I just found out it's gone," Andrew replied, glancing around again. He didn't say Daniel's name yet, but his father could see he was already looking for someone. His father sighed. "Andrew, this is your wedding. Maybe you misplaced it." Andrew shook his head firmly. No, someone took it, and I think I know who. His father followed his gaze and spotted Daniel standing near the buffet table, pouring himself a drink. Who is he? His father asked. I don't know, Andrew admitted, but he's not supposed to be here. I don't recognize him. His father looked uncertain. Be careful, son. We don't want to accuse the wrong person. That would be embarrassing. But Andrew had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to just stand there and do nothing. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his jacket and walked toward Daniel. His heart was pounding, but his steps were firm. As he approached, a few guests noticed and turned their heads, sensing something was about to happen. Daniel, unaware of Andrew's growing anger, turned to face him with a polite smile. You must be the groom, he said warmly, extending his hand. Congratulations. Andrew ignored the handshake. Who invited you? He asked, his tone sharp. Daniel raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the question. A friend of the bride's family, he answered calmly. Is something wrong? Andrew folded his arms. Yeah, something is missing from my suite. An expensive watch, and I think you know something about it. The room grew quieter as nearby guests overheard the conversation. Some turned to watch, their curiosity piqued. The air felt heavier now, and everyone waited for Daniel's response. For a moment, there was silence. Daniel looked at Andrew, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. He hadn't expected this. The energy in the room had shifted. The laughter and cheerful conversations had faded as more guests noticed the tension. Daniel took a slow breath and spoke, his voice steady. I'm sorry to hear that something is missing, but I don't know anything about it. Andrew crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Really? Because my watch was in my suite earlier today, and now it's gone. You're the only person here I don't know. Daniel's eyes flickered with understanding. He had seen this type of situation before. The quick judgment, the assumption. He had worked hard for years to build his success, yet there were always moments like this, where someone saw him and made up their mind about who he was without knowing anything about him. Still, he remained calm. Are you asking if I took it? He said, looking directly at Andrew. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried weight. Andrew hesitated for just a second before replying. I'm saying it's missing, and I need to know where it is. By now, many guests had stopped talking. Some whispered to each other, exchanging glances. Emily, the bride, had just stepped into the room after freshening up, and she noticed the crowd forming around her new husband and Daniel. She frowned, confused. What's going on? She asked, stepping closer. Andrew didn't turn to her. He was too focused on Daniel. My watch is gone, Emily. And I think this guy knows something about it. Emily's eyes widened. She looked at Daniel, then back at Andrew. Andrew, what are you saying? He's a guest. Exactly, Andrew said. A guest neither of us knows. Before Emily could respond, another voice broke in. That's enough. Everyone turned. Richard Lawson, Emily's father, had stepped forward. His face was serious as he looked at Andrew, then at Daniel. He had been watching from a distance, and now he decided it was time to intervene. Andrew, do you even know who you're talking to? Richard asked. Andrew frowned. What do you mean? Richard shook his head slightly, almost in disappointment. Then he turned to Daniel with a respectful nod. Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. The room went completely silent. Some guests exchanged surprised looks. Andrew blinked, confused. Wait, what? Richard looked at his new son-in-law. This is Daniel Carter. He's one of the most successful business tycoons in the city. He owns Carter Enterprises, one of the biggest companies in the state. Andrew's face drained of color. The name now sounded familiar. He had heard of Carter Enterprises before. Everyone had. But he had never seen Daniel in person. The guests murmured among themselves, realizing the situation had taken a dramatic turn. Andrew, who had been so confident in his accusation, now felt the weight of his mistake settling in. Andrew stood frozen, his face turning pale as he processed what Richard had just said. Daniel Carter. The name echoed in his mind. How could this man, the one he had just accused, be one of the city's most powerful business tycoons? A nervous chuckle escaped his lips. "Wait, you're telling me he's the Daniel Carter?" he asked, looking at his father-in-law in disbelief. Richard nodded firmly. "Yes, the same Daniel Carter who owns multiple companies, employs thousands of people, and has helped grow this city's economy." His voice was serious, and there was no doubt he was upset. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some guests exchanged shocked glances, while others looked at Andrew with disappointment. Meanwhile, Daniel remained calm. His expression hadn't changed, but there was a look in his eyes, one that carried experience, wisdom, and a deep understanding of what had just happened. Andrew swallowed hard. He felt the heat rising to his face. This was bad. Really bad. I didn't know," he stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. Daniel's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "No, you didn't," he said simply. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried a quiet strength. "But you assumed." Andrew flinched at the words. He glanced around and saw the way people were looking at him. His confidence was slipping. He felt small in that moment, standing in front of a man he had just insulted in front of dozens of powerful people. Emily, who had been silent, finally stepped forward. Her voice was sharp. "Andrew, do you even hear yourself? You accused a guest, without proof, on our wedding day." She shook her head, clearly upset. Andrew turned to her quickly, desperate to explain. Look, my watch is missing. I just thought." "You thought wrong," Emily cut him off. She crossed her arms, her disappointment clear. "You judged a man before even knowing who he was." Andrew opened his mouth to defend himself, but he had no words. He had no excuse. Then, just when things couldn't get any worse, a voice called out from the side of the room. "Sir, I found the watch." Everyone turned. A waiter hurried forward, holding up a shining, expensive watch. It was in the groom's suite, right on the table behind a flower vase, he explained. It must have fallen behind it earlier. A wave of silence swept across the room. The tension was thick. Daniel glanced at the watch, then back at Andrew. His eyes were calm, but they held a quiet power. "Well," he said, "I guess that solves the mystery." Andrew's face turned red with embarrassment. His heart pounded as he realized the truth. His watch had never been stolen. It had been there all along. And now, because of his quick judgment, he had made the worst mistake of his life. The room remained silent. All eyes were on Andrew, who stood frozen in place. His watch had never been stolen. It had been in his suite the entire time. His accusation, his anger, his judgment, all of it had been for nothing. Andrew swallowed hard. His mind raced for a way to fix this, to make things right. He turned to Daniel, forcing a small, nervous chuckle. "Well, this is, a big misunderstanding," he said. "I guess I jumped to conclusions." Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply studied Andrew, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow nod. "Yes," he said calmly, "you did." Andrew felt a sting in his chest. The way Daniel spoke wasn't loud or aggressive, yet his words carried weight. They made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. Richard Lawson stepped forward, his face filled with disappointment. "Andrew," he said, shaking his head, "do you realize what you've just done?" Andrew glanced at his father-in-law, his palms sweating. I didn't mean to." "You accused a man, an honored guest, without any proof," Richard interrupted, his voice firm. "And not just any man. Daniel Carter. A man who has built his success through hard work and intelligence. A man who deserved your respect from the moment he walked in." Andrew's mouth went dry. He could feel the stares from the guests, their judgment heavy in the air. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. Others simply looked at him with disapproval. Emily, his bride, was the worst of all. She had stepped away from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face wasn't just upset, it was filled with disappointment and something else. Doubt. "I can't believe this," she said softly. "On our wedding day. This is supposed to be the happiest moment of our lives, Andrew. And instead, you've embarrassed me, my family, and yourself." Andrew turned to her, panic creeping into his voice. "Emily, I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just..." "Just what?" She cut him off, jumping to conclusions. "Assuming the worst about someone you don't even know. Do you have any idea how terrible this looks?" Andrew opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could feel the ground slipping from under him. He had thought this day would be perfect, that everything would go his way. But now it felt like everything was falling apart. Daniel, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but it carried a quiet strength. "Andrew," he said, "success is not just about money or status. It's about character. And tonight, you've shown the kind of character you have." Andrew's stomach twisted. He had no response to that. The damage was done. And deep down, he knew this mistake might cost him more than just his reputation. It might cost him everything. Andrew felt his chest tighten. The weight of his mistake was heavier than he had expected. He had assumed, accused, and embarrassed himself, all in front of the most important people in his life. He turned to Emily, desperate to fix things. "Emily, please," he said softly. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I made a mistake." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with disappointment. She shook her head. "Andrew, this isn't just a small mistake. You judged someone without any proof, and instead of apologizing right away, you tried to defend yourself." Andrew swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Daniel, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm. "It went this far because you let it," he said. "You assumed something about me without knowing anything about me. And the worst part, you didn't even consider that you could be wrong." Andrew had no response. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew it wouldn't help. He had already done enough damage. Richard Lawson, Emily's father, sighed heavily. "Andrew, I had high hopes for you," he said. "But tonight, you've shown me something I can't ignore." Andrew's throat felt dry. "Mr. Lawson, please." Richard raised his hand, cutting him off. "No, this isn't just about tonight. This is about who you are as a person. And honestly, I'm not sure I want my daughter married to someone who makes judgments like this." A heavy silence filled the room. The meaning behind his words was clear. Emily took a deep breath. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I need some time to think, Andrew," she said. "I don't know if I can trust you the same way anymore." Andrew's heart pounded. His wedding day, the day that was supposed to be the start of a new life, was turning into a disaster. He looked around the room, hoping for support, but the guests only looked away. No one wanted to defend him. He turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. Truly." Daniel held his gaze for a moment before giving a small nod. "I hope you learn from this," he said. Andrew nodded quickly. "I will. I promise." But deep down, he knew words weren't enough anymore. He had hurt his reputation, his relationships, and possibly his future. And now, all he could do was hope that time would be enough to fix what he had broken. Andrew stood in the middle of the room, feeling as if the walls were closing in on him. His wedding day had turned into a nightmare, and the worst part was, it was all his fault. He had let his assumptions take over, and now he was paying the price. Emily had walked away from him, needing time to think. Her father had made it clear that he was disappointed. The guests were whispering, casting glances at him, and no one stood by his side. The shame burned inside him. Daniel Carter, the man he had wrongly accused, was still standing nearby, his face calm but unreadable. Andrew took a deep breath and stepped toward him. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice filled with regret, "I know an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know, I truly regret what I did tonight." Daniel studied him for a moment. Then, with a slight nod, he replied, "Regret is a start, but what matters is what you do next." Andrew lowered his gaze, understanding the meaning behind those words. A simple sorry wouldn't fix this. He needed to prove that he had learned from his mistake. Richard Lawson turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, I deeply regret what happened tonight," he said. "This was not the kind of evening I wanted for you." Daniel gave a small smile. "I appreciate that, Mr. Lawson. But honestly, I've dealt with moments like this before." His words were simple, but they carried a deeper meaning. Andrew winced. Moments like this. How many times had Daniel faced unfair judgment? How many times had people assumed things about him just because of the way he looked or where he came from? The thought made Andrew's shame grow even stronger. Emily finally spoke again, her voice softer now. "Andrew, I don't know what to do right now," she admitted. "I just need some space." Her words hit him hard, but he nodded. "I understand." He wouldn't push her, not after everything he had done. The guests slowly began returning to their conversations, though the atmosphere was still tense. The wedding celebration had been ruined. The joy, the laughter, it was all gone. Daniel gave one last glance at Andrew before turning to leave. As he walked away, Richard and several other important guests followed him, showing their respect. Andrew watched them go, feeling emptier than ever. He had started this day believing it would be perfect. Instead, he had lost more than he could have imagined. His reputation, his respect, and maybe even his future with Emily. As he stood there alone, one thought kept repeating in his mind. The wedding reception continued, but it wasn't the same. The music played softly, guests chatted in small groups, but the warmth of celebration had faded. The moment that should have been Andrew's happiest had turned into his most regrettable. He stood alone, watching as Daniel Carter spoke with Richard and a few other important guests. They laughed lightly, their conversation flowing easily. Daniel carried himself with confidence and grace, something Andrew now realized he had completely overlooked before. Emily was sitting at a table with her mother, her face troubled. She hadn't spoken to him since saying she needed space. Andrew's stomach twisted. Had he ruined everything with her? Would she ever forgive him? Taking a deep breath, he made his way toward Daniel. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. "Mr. Carter," he said cautiously as he approached. Daniel turned to him, his expression neutral. I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything tonight. You could have humiliated me, but you didn't." Daniel studied him for a moment before speaking. "Andrew, life has taught me that how people react under pressure shows their true character. Tonight, you showed me yours." Andrew felt a sting in his chest. "I know," he admitted, "and I don't like what I saw in myself." He sighed, looking down. "I acted out of ignorance. I let my own assumptions guide me instead of the facts, and because of that, I not only disrespected you, I let down my wife, my father-in-law, and myself." Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step, but what will you do next?" Andrew exhaled deeply. "I want to be better," he said honestly. "I don't want to be the kind of person who makes judgments like that. I know it'll take time to prove myself, but I'm willing to do the work." For the first time, Daniel gave him a small, approving smile. "Then make sure you do. Words mean nothing without action." Andrew nodded. "I will." He turned to leave but then stopped. "And, if you ever allow me the chance, I'd love to learn from you. Not just about business, but about the kind of strength and patience you showed tonight." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Then, after a brief pause, he said, "We'll see." Andrew understood. Trust wasn't given easily, but at least now he had planted the seed for change. As he walked away, he saw Emily watching him. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the disaster, she gave him a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. Andrew knew he had a long way to go, but tonight had taught him the most important lesson of his life.